All right, this video is going to go over what happens in the nephrons that ultimately results in urine being formed. And there are three basic things that are occurring. There's a filtration process, there's a reabsorption process, and then there's a secretion process. So you're going to want to either use the diagram of the nephron that you drew out in the nephron anatomy video, or there's kind of a bigger blown up version that is attached that you can also use to follow this process of urine formation. So some terms we need to just go over real quick before we begin this process, just to clarify some things before we start. So interstitial fluid, remember that this is the fluid that exists on the outside of cells, but also on the outside of blood vessels. So remember when we talked about extracellular fluid way back in the first couple weeks, extracellular fluid includes all of the fluid outside of cells, so that also includes the plasma that's in the blood. But interstitial fluid is that part of extracellular material that's not in a blood vessel and that's not in the cell. So it basically surrounds all of the cells. And in this case, it's the fluid that's going to be surrounding the nephrons. Filtration is removing substances from the blood. Reabsorption refers to moving substances from the nephron through the interstitial fluid and back into the blood, into the capillaries that are surrounding the nephron parts. And then secretion is the opposite. It's going to be moving substances from the blood capillaries through the interstitial fluid and into the nephron. So the process of making urine involves filtration stages, reabsorption stages, and secretion stages. So let's just start real quickly reviewing again the parts of the nephron, right? So here we have the glomerulus. The glomerulus is going to be capillaries, okay? And capillaries are going to be surrounded by this structure here, which is the Bowman's capsule. Then it's going to get into this twisted set of tubules called the proximal convoluted tubules, down this way, which is the loop of Henle, and then into another set of twisted tubules, which is called the distal convoluted tubule. And then this big long tube here, which is called the collecting duct. So the first step in urine formation is going to be filtration. So within the capillaries of the glomerulus, certain substances are going to be filtered out of the glomerulus, and remember those are capillaries, and into the Bowman's capsule. And this is going to create something called glomerular filtrate. The things that are going to be filtered out include sodium, chloride, glucose, amino acids, bicarbonate, potassium, creatine, and urea. Some things that are not filtered out are going to include the blood cells. They're going to stay in the glomerulus. And then proteins. They're just too big to pass through. But all of these other things are going to get removed into the Bowman's capsule. Now, here's the thing. We want a lot of these materials in our blood. They play an important role. And so even though we're taking them out at this point, most of all of these are going to end up getting put back in to our blood supply via the reabsorption steps. So again, here's your diagram. All of this is going to occur within the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. We're going to filtrate out the water, the glucose, the amino acids, the bicarbonate, the creatine, the urea, the potassium, the chloride, the sodium, and this is going to create then the glomerular filtrate. Now, all of these then are going to travel down into the proximal convoluted tubule where they're going to be either reabsorbed, secreted, or continued on through this process. So the next stage is called reabsorption and secretion within that proximal convoluted tubule. So reabsorption of the following compounds from the nephron through the interstitial fluid and back into the blood capillaries are going to include 65% of the sodium, the water, the chlorine, and the potassium. They're all going to go back into the blood. Okay, 90% of the bicarbonate, 100% of the glucose and the amino acids, and 50% of the urea. They're all going to go back to the blood. Secretion, which again, remember, is a process of going from the interstitial fluid to the nephron. That is going to be ammonia is going to be put into the nephron, into the proximal convoluted tubule, and then certain medications that we ingest are going to get put into the nephron. So basically our blood's going to want to get rid of these. So they're going to escape out of the blood vessels, the capillaries, move through the interstitial fluid into the nephron, where they will then eventually be excreted out in urine. So again, if you look at this picture here, this is the part of reabsorption. So you can see the sodium, the chlorine, the water, the potassium, the bicarbonate, they are all leaving the nephron and going back into the blood. And then within this, there are also two, ammonia and various medicines, that are going to go from the capillaries through this interstitial fluid. So you could kind of put this right here, right? Interstitial fluid back into the nephron. So in the proximal convoluted tubule, we have both reabsorption and we have secretion taking place, both processes. Now, next, we're going to go into this loop of Henle. And there's going to be a couple things that are going to occur depending on whether or not we're in the descending loop of Henle, right here, or the ascending loop of Henle, because these two sides have very different characteristics to them, particularly whether or not they allow water to pass. So in the loop of Henle, as that filtrate, the remaining filtrate with those chemicals, whatever is left over, travels down the descending loop of Henle, water is going to be reabsorbed because the tube is permeable to water. So water is going to leave, and it's going to do this through basic osmosis, right? It's going to go from high concentration of water in the tube to low concentrations in the interstitial fluid. So because water is removed, the concentration of filtrate in this part of the loop is going to become very, very concentrated. Now the ascending loop is impermeable to water. So what happens is that sodium and chloride are going to continue to be reabsorbed. About 25% of the remaining will be reabsorbed. It will go back into the bloodstream. But because the water can't leave, all of the filtrate that's remaining is going to start to become very dilute, right? Because we have all this water, but we're losing solutes still. So again, if you look, as you come down here, water is going to get reabsorbed. It's going to leave the nephron, the loop, and go back into the bloodstream, the interstitial fluid. The filtrate will be very concentrated right here. But then as we go up, the cell wall changes, or the tubule walls changes and becomes impermeable to water. Sodium and chloride will leave. They'll become reabsorbed. And because water isn't leaving, everything else that's still left in here starts to become very diluted by the water. And we're going to then take this filtrate, okay, which is a very dilute form of urine, into the distal convoluted tubules, and then eventually into the collecting duct. In the distal convoluted tubule, there's going to be even more reabsorption and secretion that takes place, not only in the distal convoluted tubule, but also within the collecting duct. So basically, about 5% of the remaining sodium and chlorine will get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. All of the remaining bicarbonate will get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Potassium ions and hydrogen ions are going to get put into the distal convoluted tubule, so they'll be secreted into those tubules. And all of these reactions are going to be driven by the presence of a hormone that's called aldosterone. This is going to cause the sodium chloride to be reabsorbed, and it's going to cause the potassium and hydrogen ions to be secreted. Usually, the distal convoluted tubules are impermeable to water, so again, we have a pretty dilute substance at this point because we're losing so many solutes, but we still have this water. Once the remaining diluted filtrate enters into the collecting duct, we're going to reabsorb some more sodium and chloride and also some more urea. And then another hormone called ADH will adjust the final water levels in urine before it is excreted out. So again, we come up into this distal convoluted tubule. We're going to reabsorb sodium chloride. We're going to reabsorb bicarbonate, and we're going to secrete potassium hydrogen. All of that is driven by aldosterone. And then once it gets into this collecting duct, we're going to reabsorb some more sodium chloride, about 5% more. We're going to reabsorb some urea, and then ADH is going to come in here, and it's going to monitor the water levels based on the fluid levels in our body. So it will either dilute the remaining urine or it will concentrate it even more, depending on what we need. And that will get explained in another lecture video. But basically what happens is that, take for instance, if we are dehydrated. If we are dehydrated, which means we have low water levels, ADH is going to open doorways in here. That's going to let water be reabsorbed. So we will be removing water from this urine in order to put it back into our interstitial fluids and our blood supply. So in a situation where water levels are low, ADH is going to open these channels and allow water out. If there's no ADH, so if there's no ADH available, so I'm going to do this in blue here. So let's say there's no ADH available, then there's no channels. These channels are called aquaporins that are open, and the water stays inside the collecting duct and then gets excreted out into urine. And so that's why when you're dehydrated, your urine looks super, super yellow and orangish. It's because the ADH is causing these channels to open and the water is leaving that remaining filtrate, and it's making it very dark and concentrated because it's not watered down as much. So this is the process of urine formation. Once the urine is formed, urine is going to be excreted out. So the collecting ducts are going to carry the urine to the calyx, which will carry it to the ureters, which will take it out to the bladder, and then eventually it'll be released out. Urine is going to be made up typically of water, urea, some sodium, some chloride, some potassiums, and then creatine. Those are going to be the chemicals that we typically find in urine. So hopefully this video helps you understand the filtration, the reabsorption, and the secretion process that is involved in urine formation.